hard to imagine knowing that someone you once stood next to, laughed with, rode in a car with, committed a violent murder. And saying nothing, not for a day, not for a week, but for years. Knowing that somewhere in your town, a family is waking up every morning without answers, watching children grow up without their mother, listening to whispers, watching investigators chase leads that go nowhere, and carrying the truth quietly inside your own chest. It's easy for us to sit behind a microphone. It's easy to listen to a podcast while we drive to work and decide what we would have done. We like to believe that we would have been brave, that we would have gone straight to the police, that we would have done the right thing immediately. We build that version of ourselves in our minds, the morally decisive, fearless version, the one untouched by intimidation, untouched by fear, untouched by the reality of being 17 years old and staring at someone that you believe is capable of committing murder. But life is not lived in hypotheticals. It's lived in moments, and those moments don't come with clarity. They come with fear. They come with threats. They come with uncertainty about whether anyone will believe you and whether the person that you're accusing will walk free and come looking for you next. We hold a 17-year-old murderer to adult standards, and we should. If you are old enough to take a life, you are old enough to face the consequences. But here's the uncomfortable question. Do we hold the 17-year-old witness to the same standard? Is the failure to speak up immediately the same as the decision to rape and murder? Those are not equal acts. They are not morally interchangeable. They are not even the same universe. And yet for years, the silence in this case has been judged as harshly as the crime itself. Tonight, we're going to talk about that silence. We're going to talk about a teenage boy who found himself holding a terrible piece of knowledge and who made a decision at 17 that many adults believe they would have handled differently. We're going to talk about whether that judgment is fair. And we're going to talk about what happened when the same young man, now grown, finally decided to put his name behind what he knew. Because that decision, years later, changed everything. It allowed investigators to move forward. It allowed science to do its job. And it allowed a family, after more than a decade, to finally hear the word guilty. This isn't a story about perfection. It's a story about fear, about growth, about consequence, and about what happens when silence finally breaks. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
It's all right. How are you, John?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good.
Good.
I could complain. I'm not going to, but...
I could complain too, but who's going to fix it?
Exactly right. So you ready to close this one out?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get into it then. I'll be honest, this case has hit me a little differently, and I think that that's probably come through in my writing in this series. I've been maybe a little more philosophical than usual.
You have been a little philosophical, but not in a bad way, just a little different. This one's gotten under your skin, and I can tell.
Yeah, it has. And I've been trying to figure out why. I think part of it is Dana's age, and I don't mean that in any diminishing way. She was a mother, a business owner, by all accounts an incredible human being, but she was 27. And when I look at 27 now as a 50-year-old, that feels impossibly young. And why are you...
Just aged yourself some more.
Well, I'm pretty clear. I'm close to 50.
Close to 50.
At 27, I was nowhere near steady, focused, or accomplished as she was. She was raising babies, and so was I, but she was running a salon. She was building a business.
Wait, you weren't running a salon?
I wasn't running a salon at 27.
I thought I knew things.
Yeah, and you don't. She was taken before she ever really had a chance to see what she could become long-term. There's something uniquely tragic about that.
It's the unfinished part, the future that never gets to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the part of why this case feels heavier. Not more important than others, but heavier. And then there's the other layer of the story. As you know, I don't mind criticizing law enforcement when they deserve it. I've done it before. I will absolutely do it again.
I'm here for it.
But in this case, I don't think that it's fair. From everything that we've walked through, they worked the evidence that they had. They followed the leads that they could, and when the case stalled, it wasn't because of laziness or incompetence. It was because they didn't have what they needed yet. And that's uncomfortable too, because sometimes justice doesn't stall from corruption. Sometimes it just stalls from lack of proof.
Which is a very different problem.
Yeah, it is. And when you're covering a case that's already been featured on Unsolved Mysteries and Forensic Files, when it's been told a dozen different ways, you have to ask yourself, or at least I ask myself, what can we add that honors the victim without repeating the same narrative? For me, that meant stepping inside the moral tension. What would it feel like to know, to believe you knew who did it, but not have the legal authority to act? To sit with that. That's the angle that we've taken in this series. Episode 1, we walk through the night that Dana was killed, the crime scene, the immediate shock to the community. Episode 2, we talked about the quiet years, the cold case years, the frustration, the waiting. And tonight we're going to finish the story. We'll talk about the silence. We're going to talk about the break in the case. And we'll talk about the trial. And we'll talk about what justice finally looked like more than a decade later. So welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue. This is the podcast where we unravel the shadows of the human mind and dive deep into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John.
And I'm your host, Angela. And together with John, we'll shine a light on the stories that keep us up at night. Unsolved disappearances, lives stolen too soon, and the questions that refuse to stay buried.
If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating or a review right now.
Do it right now.
Do it right now. It helps more than you know. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that thumbs up, ring the bell, and subscribe so that you don't miss what's coming next. And with that out of the way, let's get into part 3 of the murder of Dana Satterfield. So last week, we briefly introduced a young man named Michael Pace. He was a teenage acquaintance of Jonathan Vick, and the two of them had been together the night that Dana was killed. And Vick had made some disturbing statements to Pace. Statements about Dana, about going to see her, about what he wanted from her. For years, the narrative has sometimes implied that Pace sat on that information, but that's not entirely accurate. Roughly 3 months after Dana's murder, late 1995, Michael Pace made his first anonymous call to law enforcement. He was 17 years old. 17. He told the on-duty officer that he believed that he knew who was responsible for Dana's murder. He named Jonathan Vick. He explained that Vick had a crush on Dana and that he said that he was going to see her the night that she was killed. But Pace refused to give his name. He told investigators that Vick had threatened to kill him if he ever said anything. Now, pause there. Put yourself in the position of a 17-year-old kid whose friend tells him he's going to see a woman. That woman is murdered, and then the same friend threatens your life. If you believe that Jonathan Vick was capable of rape and murder, then you have to acknowledge something else. A 17-year-old would absolutely believe that he was capable of killing again. And that fear is important. Over the next several years, as the case went cold through the late 90s and early 2000s, Pace called again, and then again, each time anonymously, each time reinforcing that investigators needed to look at Jonathan Vick, each time adding details about Vick's statements, his interest in Dana, his movements that night. And each time detectives urged him to identify himself, and each time he refused. He consistently cited the same reason, the threat and the fear of retaliation. At some point, Pace later said he believed he had done everything that he could do. He pointed them in the right direction. He had given them a name. If they couldn't build a case, what more could he safely do? And here's another uncomfortable truth. If you call the police and you name someone as a murderer, and that person continues to walk free year after year, that reinforces your fear, because if they can't convict him and you've exposed yourself, then you're next. Yep. That had to have been part of the calculation. So now fast forward roughly 10 years after Dana's murder, around 2005. Dana's daughter, Ashley, is 18 years old at this time. She's growing up without a mother. So one day she brings her car into one of those quick oil change shops. I tried to find the name, couldn't find it. It's not important. Just like a lube shop, you know?
Yeah.
Michael Pace happens to be working there. So they talk casually while she waits. At some point, according to most accounts, through a coworker, Pace learns who she is. Some accounts say that he recognized her, but almost all of them say after she left, a coworker said who she was.
Okay.
But it doesn't really matter. He figures out that she is Dana Satterfield's daughter. And that moment changes everything. Multiple reports describe what happened next as a moral reckoning. Seeing Ashley in person, no longer a child in a news story, but a young woman standing in front of him, made the cost of silence tangible. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't a cold case file. This was a daughter who grew up without a mother. And Pace knew why. It's important to say this clearly. He had not done nothing. He'd called repeatedly. He had tried in the only way that he believed was safe at 17, at 18, at 20. But at 27, roughly the same age Dana was when she was murdered, something shifted. The difference between 17 and 27 is not small. At 17, fear dominates. At 27, responsibility does, or it's at least beginning to.
Mm-hmm.
After that encounter, Pace contacted authorities again. This time, he gave his name. He admitted that he was the anonymous caller. He provided a signed, detailed statement describing Vick's comments about Dana, Vick dropping him off that night in the Bronco, the bowling alley encounter, the death threat. Investigators later described Pace's statement as the probable cause that they needed to obtain Vick's DNA. And once they secured that DNA sample, they compared it to the semen that was recovered from Dana's rape kit. It matched. The forensic evidence aligned with the story Pace had finally attached his name to. And that is what moved the case forward. So now we always keep victims at the center of what we do here at Dark Dialogue. Dana is the reason that the story matters, but it's also true that without Michael Pace finally stepping forward publicly, this case probably would have remained unsolved. He carried that burden for roughly a decade, and when he chose to come forward, not anonymously, not cautiously, but fully, it allowed investigators to do what they couldn't do before. It gave Dana's family answers, and it put this total freaking piece of shit, Jonathan Vick, on a path to trial. I don't like this kid at all.
Couldn't tell.
While Michael Pace was carrying the weight of what he knew, Jonathan Vick was building a pattern. In the late 1990s, approximately 96 to 99, Vick enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. His time there did not reflect stability. Records show that he was disciplined on at least 2 separate occasions under military law for assault, one involving a male Marine and another involving a female Marine. Reports describe a violent temper and repeated aggression. Those incidents ultimately led to his discharge. Once back in civilian life, the pattern did not stop. He was arrested more than once, including for domestic violence and vandalism, though those charges were later dropped. While the civilian cases did not result in convictions, the arrests themselves added to a documented history of volatility and aggression. Former coworkers reportedly described him as antagonistic and combative. He struggled to maintain steady employment. The instability followed him. One former girlfriend, Cora Kent, later told investigators that while driving past Dana's former salon, Vick warned her that if she did not do what he told her to do, she would end up like Dana. That's important because it ties his ongoing abusive behavior to a murder that had already occurred. It reflects not just anger, but weaponized intimidation rooted in a specific act of violence. And then, in 2002, another young woman entered his life. Her name was Heather Renee Sellers. Heather was approximately 20 years old. She worked at the Waffle House near Highway 9 and Interstate 85 in Spartanburg County. She and Vick were in a serious relationship. At various times, he was described as her boyfriend, her fiancé, and her former fiancé, indicating that the relationship had progressed to engagement and then it had fractured. Heather's family later reported that Vick was abusive during that relationship. No formal reports were filed with law enforcement, so there is no criminal record that is tied specifically to those allegations, but the family statements establish a pattern that is consistent with his entire freaking life. On September 24, 2002, roughly 2 weeks after ending their engagement, Heather finished her shift at the Waffle House. Earlier that day, her grandmother had dropped her off for work. Heather brought her uniform and a change of clothes because she planned to spend the night at her aunt's house after her shift. Instead, she went out with Jonathan Vick. They were seen together that evening at least 2 local bars, including the Rainbow Lounge
And your favorite.
Cocktails and Dreams. Give me a freaking break. Multiple summaries confirm that they were together that night. Heather was never seen again. She never made it to her aunt's house. She never returned to work. She never picked up her final paycheck. Something her family said was completely out of character because she needed that money. Jonathan Vick was the last known person to see her alive. From an investigative standpoint, that fact alone places him at the center of the case. Add that to a recently ended engagement, allegations of domestic abuse, his documented history of violence, and his presence with her the night that she disappeared. He became the primary suspect in Heather's disappearance very early in the investigation. Law enforcement mapped her final movements that night out with Vick. They confirmed the bar sightings. They confirmed the timeline. And then something unusual happened. Another Waffle House employee, Michelle Whitaker, disappeared in August of 2002. Very close in time and geography to Heather's case. Because Vick frequented that restaurant and was already under suspicion in Heather's disappearance, investigators and media outlets immediately connected him to both cases. And for years, Michelle Whitaker was considered missing. But in 2008, she was located alive and well in Oregon. She had left voluntarily and reportedly did not even realize that she had been listed as missing. That development obviously removed Vick from that case entirely, but Heather Sellers' disappearance remains unsolved. And while he has never been formally charged in Heather's case, his proximity, his history, and pattern of violence keep him at the central part of it. But by the time Heather vanished in 2002, Jonathan Vick had already established a documented history of aggression in the military, in civilian arrests, in his personal relationships. And that matters when you're evaluating risk because patterns are not coincidences. They are trajectories. Once Michael Pace gave his signed statement, the case shifted from suspicion to action. For years, investigators had believed Jonathan Vick was involved, but belief is not probable cause, and without probable cause, they could not compel a DNA sample. Pace's detailed statement changed that. He identified himself as the anonymous caller. He described the bowling alley conversation. He described the blue and white Bronco. He described Vick saying that he was going to see Dana that night. And he described the threat that followed the murder. And that was enough. Investigators secured a warrant to obtain Vick's DNA. When that sample was compared to the semen recovered from Dana's 1995 rape kit examination, the profiles matched. That match became the evidentiary cornerstone of the case. Only after the DNA confirmation did law enforcement move forward with an arrest warrant. On October 24, 2005, Jonathan Christian Vick, age 27, was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. Sheriff Chuck Wright publicly announced the arrest the same day, stating that Dana Satterfield's killer had finally been identified. Law enforcement emphasized something important at the time. Vick had been investigated in 1995, but in 1995, there just wasn't enough physical evidence to tie him to the crime. And without probable cause, they couldn't legally obtain his DNA. The case didn't stall because the investigators ignored him. It stalled because the evidentiary threshold had not yet been met. The revival of the case was attributed to two things: new witness cooperation with Michael Pace and the resulting DNA evidence. Not a confession, not luck, not a sudden breakthrough, a witness plus science. So roughly 11 years after Dana Satterfield was murdered, Jonathan Asshat Vick went to trial in 2006. The prosecution's case rested on three pillars: DNA, witness testimony, and Vick's own statements to others. Michael Pace testified in detail. He told the jury that on July 31st, 1995, he and Vick were at a bowling alley snack bar. Vick began talking about Dana, making explicit sexual comments about what he wanted to do to her. Pace described the remarks as graphic and aggressive, not casual teenage talk. And I'll just say, having been a teenage boys are like rude and crude and nasty.
Mm-hmm.
So for a teenage boy to be like, holy shit, that's like over the top.
Yeah.
It had very raunchy, nasty talk.
Yeah.
When Pace laughed and dismissed the idea that Vick had a chance with an older business owner, Vick became defensive and angry. Later that night, Vick drove Pace home in the blue and white Bronco. He told Pace that he was going to get his hair cut. Pace questioned the timing. Like, who the hell's going to cut your hair at this freaking time at night?
Right.
And Vick said that he was going to go over to Dana's and that she was expecting him. Days later, after the murder became public, Pace encountered Vick again at the bowling alley. That is when the threat occurred. Pace testified that Vick told him that he would kill him if he ever told anyone what he knew. That threat became central to explaining Pace's years of anonymity. The prosecution then layered additional evidence: eyewitness testimony placing a blue and white Bronco near the salon, a motorist who saw a man matching Vick's description, testimony from a fellow detainee who said Vick made incriminating statements while in custody, testimony from former girlfriend Cora Kent, who recounted Vick telling her that she would end up like that woman if she didn't obey him. But most critically, the DNA. The state reconstructed the crime as follows. Vick went to the salon after hours. He made unwanted sexual advances. He obviously was rejected, so he turned off the lights. He assaulted her, he raped her, he strangled her, and he left her body staged inside the bathroom before fleeing through a window. The defense had very little to counter the DNA. They focused on two arguments: a stray pubic hair that was found on Dana's body that didn't match Vick, and the timing of the semen deposit could not be scientifically established. They argued the hair could belong to another man and that the semen might have been deposited at some other time, obviously an unproven time. But the murder occurred in a restroom used by male customers. It was specifically the men's room. The presence of a stray hair alone did not outweigh a confirmed semen match tied to an assault victim. It could have easily been the pubic hair of just some random customer.
Yeah.
Vick pleaded not guilty. The trial lasted for 4 days, which I thought was really short.
4 days?
Yeah. Approximately 30 witnesses testified. Some of the sources cited 32. It's not really that important. On November 30th, 2006, the case went to the jury. Deliberation lasted roughly 20 minutes.
Wow. 4 days and 20 minutes.
Yeah. Some accounts describe it as less than 20. Others say approximately 25. Regardless of the exact number, I read the quote that they wouldn't have had time to watch a sitcom in the amount of time that they wouldn't have had time to.
They couldn't get their coffee.
They couldn't eat lunch. They couldn't even really eat a snack. I mean,
you could do anything.
It was like they walked in there and was like, everybody on the same page?
Dude,
yep.
You did it.
Okay, 10, 9, 8. So, okay, call the bailiff. We're ready to go.
Yeah.
The verdict: guilty of murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of criminal sexual conduct. Because Vick was 17 at the time of the crime, he was not eligible for the death penalty. So he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, plus 30 years for the criminal sexual conduct, plus 30 years for the kidnapping. And the sentences required him to serve at least 20 years before any parole eligibility. When the verdict was read, poor little Vicky cried like a little baby.
Oh, man.
At sentencing, he continued to deny his involvement, stating that justice had not been done. His wife, addressed the court and asked for leniency. She insisted that he was innocent. She had a young child at home. Now, whatever her private reality may have been, she stood by him in that courtroom. I gotta say, I don't judge this girl at all. She's a young mom. She's probably been abused by this total piece of shit.
Yeah.
And she
probably doesn't know how to do anything or where anything is.
And she's scared to death. Yeah. And I don't know their circumstances. I just think it's important to say, I don't judge this poor girl.
Right.
Mike Satterfield, Dana's husband, embraced his children after the fact. After 11 years, the waiting was over. The 2006 trial did not hinge on emotion. It hinged on DNA, corroborated by testimony, and a witness who finally put his name on paper. And a jury that only needed a couple minutes to decide.
Me too.
Oh, yeah. This guy's a total piece of shit.
I hope the wife and child are doing well, though.
I do too. Yeah, I really do. And yeah, poor kid, man, growing up with a dad. I mean,
yeah.
A lot of kids do, but it can be easy for any of them. So there's one more piece that has to be addressed. In 2006, the same year that Jonathan Vick was convicted of kidnapping, rape, and murder, an abandoned vehicle registered to him was located. And inside that vehicle, investigators found biological material. Reports indicate the presence of bloodstains and blonde hair. Detectives have publicly stated that they believe the material might be connected to Heather Renee Sellers, the young woman who disappeared in 2002 after being seen with Vick. But here is what we know with certainty. There has been no publicly confirmed DNA match that links that biological material to Heather Sellers. No conclusive forensic announcement has ever tied the vehicle evidence directly to her disappearance, which means the evidence remains extremely suggestive, but not definitive. And that's important. However, it is also true that when blood and hair are discovered inside a vehicle belonging to a man who has now been convicted of violent sexual homicide, investigators do not ignore it. They can't. Jonathan Vick is not a hypothetical suspect. He is a convicted murderer. He was found guilty for kidnapping, raping, and killing a 27-year-old woman. His documented history includes violent sexual assaults in the military, civilian arrests. Yes.
So why isn't it verified? Do we find out? Am I foreshadowing?
You're not foreshadowing. We don't know.
Don't test with her and her family and...
I couldn't find shit about that. I don't know if the DNA was degraded and not testable. It's odd to me.
I am deeply disturbed by that.
It's very odd to me. This is what you run into. It's a completely open case. There ain't shit. I mean, there's very, very little that you can find about her or this case. I think that it's probably because it's an open case and they're probably still actively working it, so they haven't released shit except that they have this evidence. If it was hers, I gotta believe that it would have been charged. But,
yeah.
I'm the same way. I don't know. But no, you're not foreshadowing. We don't find out.
Damn.
But his documented history includes violent assaults in the military, civilian arrest, threats toward intimate partners, and a pattern of escalating aggression. That pattern is not speculation. It is part of the public record. The fact that he was 17 at the time that he committed the murder of Dana Satterfield is, in itself, very significant. Juvenile violent crime is not unheard of, but sexual violence at that level, premeditated, coercive, lethal, is statistically way less common in offenders that young. It reflects something deeply abnormal in behavioral development. And the reality that he lived freely in the community for 10 years after the murder raises a very difficult but unavoidable question. And that is, was Heather Sellers the only other potential victim? We do not have evidence that answers that question, but we do have enough documented behavior to justify asking it. Heather disappeared in 2002 after being seen with him. Her family reported prior abuse. He was the last known person with her, and the biological material was later recovered from a vehicle that was registered to him. Now, those are facts. Whether those facts ultimately lead to accountability in Heather's case remains unresolved, but her disappearance cannot be separated from this story because Dana Satterfield was not the only young woman whose life intersected with Jonathan Vick. And one case ending in conviction does not automatically resolve the others. And I said earlier that this case hit me differently, and that's true. And not because it's more violent than the others, and not because it's more complex, but because of the contrast. If you look at the photographs from the crime scene, and I strongly recommend that you do not, but if you look at those photos and then you look at the photos of Dana Satterfield in life, the dissonance is hard to reconcile. In life, she looks exactly like she was, a young mother, a business owner, a woman building something for herself and her children, 27 years old. From where I stand now, that feels impossibly young. When I think about, what I was doing at 27 compared to what she was building, raising her kids, like I said, I was too, but running a salon, building a business, holding her life together, it really puts things into perspective. She deserved decades more. And then there's Heather Renee Sellers. And when you put their photographs side by side, it's jarring. I mean, they could have been sisters easily.
So he had a type.
Oh yeah, beautiful blonde women, but their likenesses are just eerily the same. Like you could almost say, if you look at the two pictures, you look at Heather's picture, you could almost be like, oh yeah, that's Dana like at 17 or like Dana at 20. I mean, they look very, very much alike. But Dana at 27, Heather at 20, both at the beginning of their adult lives, both with time stretching out in front of them. Heather, by all available accounts, had recognized that she was in a relationship that was not healthy. She had called off the engagement. She had begun to pull away. That takes strength at 20 years old. And then she disappeared. Dana's husband, Mike Satterfield, was left to raise their children alone while being scrutinized, questioned, and at times viewed as the suspect in the very crime that had shattered his family. And from everything that I was able to find, Mike carried that burden and raised those children with stability and commitment. There's a quiet kind of strength in that. And those kids grew up without their mother. That is the cost that does not show up in court transcripts. That is the cost that doesn't fit neatly into evidence exhibits. When violent crime happens, we talk about charges, timelines, verdicts, sentencing, but what it actually does is tear holes in families. It removes people from dinner tables. It leaves birthdays empty. It forces children to grow up without a parent who should have been there to guide them. You can't quantify that. You can't balance it out with a life sentence. And when the offender was 17 years old at the time that he committed the crime, it forces a hard realization. Some acts don't make sense. They don't fit into clean sociological explanations. They don't come with tidy origin stories that allow us to believe that they were preventable. Sometimes evil is simply chosen. And the only response available to the rest of us is to stand on the side of the people that it harmed. To remember Dana Satterfield as more than a crime scene. To remember Heather Sellers as more than a missing person file. To acknowledge the families who had to rebuild around absence. There isn't a clever line that fixes everything. There isn't a perfect way to end a story like this. There's only the truth of what happened and the responsibility to do our best to tell it carefully. For more than a decade, the truth in this case existed in pieces. It existed in a rape kit stored in evidence, in a teenage boy's memory, in a threat whispered in a bowling alley, in a blue and white Ford Bronco seen near a darkened salon. But truth and proof are not the same thing, and until proof exists in a form that the law can use, justice doesn't move. It can't. Dana Satterfield was 27 years old when she was murdered. She wasn't a symbol, she wasn't a cautionary tale, and she wasn't a headline. She was a mother, a business owner, and a young woman building a life. Her kids grew up without her. Her husband carried suspicion that he did not deserve. Her family waited, not for certainty, but for something solid enough to stand on. And for 10 years, that solidity did not exist. The silence in this case was not absence, it was limitation. Investigators could suspect, they could interview, they could document, but they could not compel DNA without probable cause. And they could not build a case on instinct. It took a witness, finally willing to sign his name, to cross the legal threshold. And once that happened, the science spoke. The match was clear. And when the case finally went to trial, it did not collapse under scrutiny. It held. The jury deliberated for minutes, not hours, not days, minutes. Because the evidence was there, because the testimony aligned, and because the doubt the defense attempted to introduce could not overcome the weight of what had been proven. Jonathan Vick was convicted, life in prison plus decades more. No death penalty because he was 17 at the time of the murder. That fact does not soften what he did. It simply defines the sentence that the law allowed. But conviction is not restoration. It does not return a mother to her children. It does not erase the years that Heather Sellers' family has lived without answers. It does not undo the fear carried by a teenager who believed a threat. Justice in a courtroom is finite. The impact of violence is not. This case forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Sometimes the truth is known long before it can be proven. Sometimes the system moves slower than grief. And sometimes the only thing separating suspicion from accountability is one person deciding they are finally ready to stand in the light. Michael Pace's decision did not create the evidence. It just unlocked it. But once it was unlocked, the case moved exactly as it should have, deliberately, lawfully, and successfully. Dana Satterfield's story did not end in uncertainty. It ended with a verdict. Heather Sellers' story, however, remains open. And that matters because one conviction does not automatically close every wound that's connected to a violent person's life. What remains at the end of this three-part arc is not outrage, it's not theory, and it's not philosophical reflection. What remains is this. A young woman was murdered. Her killer was identified through DNA. He was tried before a jury and he was convicted. And a family, after more than a decade, finally had something solid to hold on to. But it's not enough. It never is. It is the difference between suspicion and accountability, though. And sometimes, in cases like this, that difference is everything. Before we move to the victim tribute, we need to pause like we always do. Throughout this series, we have used the song Under Glass Skies by the J.J. Hawk Band during Dana Satterfield's tribute. That song was chosen intentionally, and it belongs to Dana. It belongs to her story. And when we revisit her case across multiple episodes, we don't change that. The music remains tied to the victim and not to the episode. But tonight, there's something additional that needs to be acknowledged. There is another name that has appeared throughout this arc, Heather Renee Sellers. Heather's disappearance has never been resolved in a courtroom. There's not been a conviction, no verdict, no formal conclusion. What we know, and only what we know, is that she was last seen alive with Jonathan Vick in September of 2002. We know she had ended an engagement. We know she was trying to move forward. We know she never picked up her final paycheck. We know her family never saw her again. There is very little publicly available documentation about her case, not enough for a full episode built on verified record. And we will not fill that silence with speculation. But absence of information does not mean absence of loss. Heather's life intersected with this story. She deserves to be remembered within it. So tonight, as Under Glass Skies plays, as it always has for Dana, we also make space for Heather. Not because their cases are legally identical, not because their outcomes are the same, but because both young women had their futures interrupted. Dana's case ended in a conviction. Heather's remains unresolved. Both realities deserve acknowledgement. This is Under Glass Skies by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is tribute for Dana Satterfield and Heather Renee Sellers. Heather Renee Sellers was 20 years old. 20. An age where the world still feels wide open, where mistakes can be corrected, where leaving a bad relationship can still mean starting over somewhere brighter. She worked at the Waffle House near Highway 9 and I-85. She had family who expected her to come home. She had a final paycheck she never picked up. She had plans to stay with her aunt after her shift. She had already taken that first hard step, ending an engagement that, by family accounts, had become unhealthy. That matters. It takes strength to walk away at 20. It takes clarity to recognize that something isn't right. It takes courage to say no to a future that you no longer want. And then she disappeared. There is no courtroom transcript that tells us what happened to Heather. There's no verdict that closes her file. There is only absence. Her family has lived for years inside that absence, without confirmation, without remains, without a trial. Her name exists in this story not because we know every answer, but because she mattered. Because she was seen alive for the last time with a man later convicted of violent murder. Because her life stopped abruptly. Because unresolved does not mean unimportant. Heather Renee Sellers was more than a footnote in somebody else's case. She was a daughter, a young woman trying to build a life, and she deserves to be remembered in her own right. Dana Satterfield was 27 years old, a mother, a business owner, a woman who had built something with her own hands. She owned her salon. She raised her children. She was navigating the complicated realities of adult life, marriage, independence, responsibility, like so many young parents do. On July 31st, 1995, that life was violently taken. Her children lost their mother. Her husband lost his partner. Her family lost a daughter and a sister. For more than a decade, they lived in uncertainty, knowing something horrific had happened, but without the legal resolution that allows grief to settle into something solid. Dana's case ended in a conviction. DNA matched, a jury deliberated for minutes, a sentence was handed down, but conviction does not restore life. It does not give children back their mother. It does not rewind birthdays or holidays or school events that passed without her. It does not establish accountability. And in cases like this, accountability matters. Dana Satterfield was not defined by the violence that ended her life. She was defined by the life she built before it. And that is what we choose to remember. Two young women, 20, 27, different circumstances, different legal outcomes, but both stopped far too soon. One case resolved in court, one still unresolved in absence. Both families altered forever. When we tell stories like these, we can get lost in timelines and forensic evidence and courtroom strategy, but beneath all of that are lives, real lives. Heather Renee Sellers, Dana Satterfield. As Under Glass Skies plays, we remember them not as case files, not as evidence exhibits, but as daughters, as women, as people whose futures should have stretched decades beyond the moments that took them. May they be remembered with dignity, and may their families know that their names are spoken carefully here. So that wraps that one up. What are your thoughts?
Ick.
Yeah, it really blows my mind that we're talking about a crime like this at 17 years old.
Yeah.
Like, I find it hard to believe that Heather was the only victim. Maybe she was, but...
Dana?
Heather was the only additional victim. I firmly believe that he killed Heather.
I do too.
I guess I should say speculatively, but I do believe that that he was responsible.
Our opinion.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't believe that Heather was the only additional victim. We know we killed Dana. There's no question about that. But
right.
I mean, when you're assaulting men and women in the Marine Corps, I mean, it's not like you're going to, I don't know, like the Weakling Club or something. It's the freaking U.S. Marines.
Yeah.
I mean, that really speaks to somebody. Yeah. Anyway, if you've been following this series and you care about cases like Dana Satterfield's and about unresolved cases like Heather Sellers, there are ways that you can take action beyond listening. The Dark Dialogue Collective is not a donation tier. It's action-based. It's boots-on-the-ground volunteers who assist with physical searches, awareness efforts, and support for families when it's appropriate. If you're someone who wants to contribute time and effort in the real world, that's where you look.
If you want to get involved from wherever you are, our Adopt a Victim program is available at www.darkdialogue.com. That program focuses on unresolved cases only. You can adopt a victim, research their case, help identify unnamed victims, or work towards uncovering information about unidentified offenders. It's structured research, not speculation. We also maintain written victim blogs at darkdialogue.com where you can read deeper breakdowns of cases and share those stories to increase visibility.
If you want to support the show directly, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/darkdialoguepod for recurring support, or make a one-time contribution at ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/darkdialogue. For long-form written analysis and updates, subscribe to our Substack at darkdialoguecrime.substack.com. If you have case suggestions, information, kudos, questions, or would like to reach us directly for any reason, email us at info@darkdialogue.com.
And as always, don't forget to check out the other shows on the Dark Dialogue Network: Rocky Mountain Reckoning, Dark Dialogue Distilled, Dark Dialogue Unraveled Truths, Dark Dialogue Gallows and Gunfights, and of course, Dark Dialogue Shadow Chat Sessions. Each one approaches true crime from a different angle, but all of them stay centered on the victims.
If this episode mattered to you, help it reach someone else. Like the episode, leave a review, share it, subscribe, ring the bell if you're watching on YouTube. Those small actions matter more than most people realize. They increase visibility, push the algorithm, and make sure these stories aren't buried. Until next time, keep listening, keep sharing, stay vigilant, and keep the dialogue alive.